Hey folks, Rob here bringing another video. This one's going to be another Tactics 101 and it's going to be dealing with half squads. So calling it the whole half squad, we're going to talk about everything you can do with them, how they show up, and what you should not do with them. And let's get into it. So what we're going to cover is some weaknesses and strengths, how to use them, how not to use them. Now, there is a journal article, it's number 11, which I don't have, and it's called The Halfling from Aaron Cleven. I'm hoping to get this journal article, and if I do get it, then I'm hoping to revisit this video and maybe I'll do a 201 tactics and reference that article. But it's apparently quite good, draws on a lot of resources and experienced players. So I highly encourage you to read it if you already have the magazine, or get it if you don't. Journal is usually pretty good for that kind of stuff. Again, I wish I had it, but I don't. So I'm just going to be going off of what I know and what I've gleaned from looking at the internet and Game Squad forums. So here's some basics for half squads. Now, we all know what a half squad is, right? It's half of a 10-man or 12-man squad, and typically it's represented by a 2-unit silhouette. However, it's not available to all nationalities by default. You can be broken down into half squads if you have casualty reduction, or if you split up into half squads to take, for example, prisoners. But typically, you're not allowed to deploy naturally if you belong to some nationalities like Russians, the communist Chinese, and Italians and Ethiopians, unless you're elites. There's also in the footnotes of Chapter A on partisans, they recommend that they don't deploy. So typically that's only by SSR, but barring SSR, you can apparently deploy partisans. So there's that to consider. Again, the exception to all this is when you're taking prisoners and you want to act as a guard. Any nationality is allowed to freely deploy into your half squad components, so you can take on that role, and which is one way to get around the limitation. There's other exceptions that apply as well. Sangered guns in the desert, for example, is one. If you have to get onto landing craft or gliders and the portage point capacity is just not enough to carry, say, full squad with weapons, so you're sometimes allowed, sometimes by SSR, to break down into your half squad components. As well, if your nationality is allowed to deploy, you can start every scenario with up to 10%, rounded up, of your at start OB deployed. Now, that you can do that freely, you don't have to make any kind of task checks. And anytime you have reinforcements showing up, it's part of your OB as well. 10% of those as well can also be freely deployed when you come on during their turn. Now, during every rally phase, you also, provided you're with a good order leader, exception to that, of course, is the Finns, is if you take a normal task check with that leader, you can then deploy any squads with him into their half squad components. Just be advised, that's the only action in the rally phase that that leader can do and those squads can do. So you can't pick up weapons on the ground and deploy, or the leader cannot rally other broken units and deploy a squad, for example. It's going to be one action, and that's either deploy a squad or do something else. Finns are one of the exceptions when it comes to deploying, because they can deploy by themselves. They just take a one task check. All right, so here you can see some examples of the various counters I pulled up from the various nationalities. You have the allies on the left, and then you have two columns of acts on the right. And you can see some of the weaknesses apparent right there. Sometimes, as usually the case, you have a broken morale that is usually one less, sometimes two less than the unbroken morale factor, which is, of course, a huge concern, especially when you're talking green troops and conscripts. When you have a Russian 226 that has a 4 broken morale, it's not coming back anytime soon, unless you have a commissar in a fanatic building, maybe. But generally, those are going to be the last troops that are going to be rallying, usually. Half squads are usually one step away from breaking for good and or KIA. Remember, that's your last step. Once that breaks, it never comes back, especially if it's disrupted. And isolated by itself with no leader, you're just never going to get it back in action anytime soon. You're always going to have a lower and reduced firepower than the full squad, and you're never going to have the capability like a full squad has, which is a larger firepower, longer range, sometimes assault fire, spray fire capabilities. You're not going to have any kind of that stuff. And sometimes you're even going to have underlying morale, which your half squad component may or may not have. You also have a very situational use for when to use a half squad. If you are in the process of deciding when to deploy or when not to, you really have to look at the situation you're faced with and determine whether or not it's in your best interest, because there are glaring weaknesses with the half squad. Maybe a full squad would better serve your purpose, but again, it's situational when you could or could not use it. If you have a lot of first line, maybe elite troops, and you want to cart a couple DCs around and blow stuff up, or you want to do some tank hunting and you got the right kind of squads, by all means. Or you have a lot of Panzerfaust you want to use, knock yourself out. However, if you have a lot of low value troops, you may want to avoid that as much as possible. If you play the Japanese, for example, your strength is that stripe ability. You don't want to reduce yourself to half squad status as much as possible, because then you're going to be breaking. And the strength of the Japanese, as I said, is a stripe, where you're just reduced in quality, you're not broken. So on the strength side, you have several strengths which they can be used for. Again, we'll get into this in a second. They can be used to strip enemy concealment. You bump into a concealed stack, you'll get bounced back, and the enemy will have to fire on you, and they'll lose concealment in the process. If you have units on op fire, this gives you a chance to shoot into them, and without having to have your firepower in the advancing fire phase, which is really handy. You can cover more ground because you have more units at your disposal. So if you're scouting or if you're trying to control buildings, it lets you do that more readily. You have the same IPC as a squad, and you actually have, in fact, twice as much if you break down into your two half squad components. Again, there's a cost to that, but you have to play into that depending on what you're trying to do. You can use half squads as spotters for mortars. That's a good use for them. One half squad could be behind a building with a mortar. The other half could be up on the second level, stay concealed, and just spot. You can also man support weapons. A good use for them is in the back rear, especially because with the longer ranges available to your machine guns, that's a good use for them in the back. Your squads typically can't engage anyways, so why waste a squad's firepower out of range when you can just use a half squad? You can use them in advance if you can get them around behind the enemy to cut off route paths. Another good use for half squads, as well as escorting PWs and acting as guards. And again, even if you cannot deploy nationally, when you act as a guard, you're allowed to automatically deploy into a half squad status. So that's pretty cool. All right, so having said all that, what can we do with half squads? Now, so they can be used for multiple purposes, like we already discussed. So you can use them to man support weapons. So we can have things like machine guns. As we said, you hang your half squads in the back with your neg leaders up on a second floor with your heavy weapons, your mediums and your heavies. You're not going to use your squad's inherent firepower anyways, so you use a half squad for that. Or you can deploy them forward with anti-tank weapons. For example, in this scenario that Steve and I played the other day, ASL 122, this is December 44 in Budapest, Hungary. So we have Hungarians who have Panzerfaust capability. So here you have a half squad with a chance of rolling for a Panzerfaust. He needs a 1 or a 2. And look at that, we just have a Panzerfaust capability. Now he looks to see what he needs to hit. And in this case, I hit. Steve hit me as well. And then unfortunately, he rolled a boxcar. A Panzerfaust is like a 31. And basically anything but a 12, and he's going to kill that T-34-85. So this would be turned into a flaming wreck at the cost of a half squad Panzerfaust. So again, tank hunting teams can be very useful for your half squad purpose, again, depending on the nationality and the circumstances. You can also use them for bumping and scouting and bumping into concealed stacks. So say, for example, it was the Hungarian movement turn, and this unit here is concealed. And we want to, let me do that properly. We want to bump the concealment. Say these guys here is a fire base. We'll put them on op fire in the prep fire phase. In the movement phase, assuming no other units are around, we're going to take our half squad here and we're going to move him in, and then we're going to enter the building. The guy has a choice. Either he can fire at them when they're close and lose concealment, or I'll bump into him, I'll get bumped back, he'll lose concealment, and he'll still have to first fire them because they're inside his hex. So either way, he's going to be losing his concealment, and worst case, you lose a half squad, and now your op fire in your advancing fire phase, you're going to have a good shot. A lot better than if you had done a prep fire phase, in this case 8 firepower. It would have been halved on the 4 up 3 in stone, so you don't want that. So again, you can use that for bumping and scouting. Similarly, say you have, you know that their opponent has minefields. You don't know if this building is mined. Maybe it has a set DC capability. You can come here and then you can spend points doing your searching. This is all in Chapter A, so look up searching. In this case, you roll a number, and this number of hexes you cannot search. So I can search 2 hexes, so I'm going to search this one and this one here, and I'll determine whether or not there's any mines in here. So again, half squads are used for scouting and searching, and that way you're not risking your big units and your big stacks by entering a building. A story I always tell is when we were playing Red Barricades back in the day, I moved 3 assault engineer squads and a leader into a building in Stalingrad. They blew it up and killed my complete German pioneer platoon because he had a set DC. I didn't think. I thought, there's a building, let's go to safety. And sure enough, it was rigged and he blew it up. If I would have searched, I would have found it, and I would have saved 3 squads and a leader. So that was pretty bad. Just remember your searching ability. You spend 1 movement point, and you can search as many hexes as a die roll will allow. Another good use is denying route paths. So assume this unit's broken. This building is the victory objective. You have to get units into that building. All you need is a half squad behind you, and now suddenly you're denying route path to the victory condition building. All right, you're forcing the broken unit to route away from where he wants to go. So once you get behind enemy lines, then, and this is going to be a leader here in this example, once you get behind enemy lines, you can interdict, prevent routing, maybe even eliminate for failure to route if you can get adjacent to it on the other side, maybe get some encirclement or what have you. But getting in behind the lines, you'll be able to deny route paths. And then another good use for it on the attack is even if he does not fire on your first squad, say he holds fire, and then you decide, well, I still have to move, so I'm going to move another squad. He decides to take his first fire shot, whatever that is. We'll do an 8 down 2 shot. All right, that's going to hurt. It's a 1 check. All right, so now we're going to ELR and break. Now he's first fired. Now I can move freely to this hex because this unit, assuming again no other units exist, this unit is now forced to fire at this unit because it's the closest enemy unit. So as long as I stay within 2 hexes away from this unit, I can move with impunity and not be shot at because I've sacrificed a half squad, which he's going to have to shoot at next. So again, at the sacrifice of a half squad, and at the risk of losing maybe 1 or 2 units, depending on how it works out, you could save a lot of your moving force by applying it that way. When it comes to defense, you have to be more judicious when you use them. Say the Russians were attacking the Hungarians in this case, and we have a couple of half squads forward. Let's move some of this out of the way. We'll set up back in depth. All right, we'll get rid of all that. So in a situation like this, when you have attack and forces, You want to set up half squads forward for a couple of purposes. One is to act like a speed bump. You understand that this guy is probably going to stay and he's probably going to die, and he's going to either draw inordinate amount of fire if your attacker's not thinking, or he's going to be ignored. At a minimum, what he's going to be able to do is strip concealment. Now, in this particular case, he's only 137, so it's 1 firepower. A 1 down 1, 1 down 2 can still cause some damage, so they're not insignificant. But generally speaking, he's not going to be very effective in stopping what's coming at him, especially if his tank parks his ass right on top of him, which is probably an advisable plan. But what it will prevent is units moving, again, in the open with large amounts of concealment and moving large bounds. They're going to have to stay assault moving into non-open ground areas. They're not going to be able to take large leaping bounds, dashing across into streets, for example, like this. Assuming this unit was here, it would be able to bust concealment. So they're a form of early warning and or a speed bump, but just bear in mind that they're going to be very fragile. So you're probably going to lose your scouts. If you have the time and the space allotted to you by the enemy, make sure you fall back. Don't throw them away willy-nilly. You do have limited resources as a defender. You don't want to just throw your units away, but sometimes you may want to set them forward to act as an early warning or a speed bump. And again, every time you can strip away concealment, it makes your other units a lot easier to shoot into them when they don't have concealment, because when you start having assaulting troops, especially with assault fire capability that are concealed moving into hardened fortifications, it's almost impossible to really impact them unless you have your own Death Star stack. So you really want to strip concealment as much as possible, and if you can keep a half squad with eyes on them, it just makes your job that much easier. All right, so that being said, let's talk about how not to use your half squads. You have to make sure that they're supported in their tasks. Again, you cannot sacrifice them needlessly. You always need to have your ultimate goal in mind as a defender. You have to be aware of their reduced capabilities. So in this case here, we're in Stalingrad. We have a 247 half squad and 2 firepower versus first line Russians 447s. It's just not going to be useful. First of all, you're in stone, which is +3. You have a 447, so in hand to hand, you're going to be 1 to 2 odds, which is again is not really good. They're going to be stealthy, and depending on circumstances, maybe they'll get ambush, and it's just going to be a losing cause. So what I did is I made a couple of mistakes. I used my half squad to start taking territory, thinking, well, I'm going to grab a lot of territory for purposes of my front line extension. And sure enough, Dave jumped on me through a little bit of close combat. Doesn't he get ambushed and kill my half squad? Why? Because it was a single half squad. This is a 4-4 or it was a 527, I believe, with I think it was an ATR. At any rate, he jumped on my squad. I think I survived the first round, but he ended up killing my half squad because it just was unsupported. It's all by its lonesome out in the middle of nowhere. So make sure that when you send your scouts forward or have them forward as speed bumps, that you support them to some degree, and be aware of how fragile that they can be. If you're isolated like they were in this case, they can be very easily destroyed. And if they're not acting like a speed bump, just casualty VP for your opponent, then they're really not serving a purpose. Specialized equipment is not always going to be available, so when you depend on things like, say this is late war, we want Panzerfaust, half squads have a lesser chance than a full squad of getting one. I believe a half squad needs a 2, for example. The ATMMs, for example, you also get a lesser die roll requirement. Things like that, Molotov cocktails, all those things are sometimes dependent on unit size, and a half squad will be lesser chance. So you may get a modifier to your die roll based on your unit size. and you can't necessarily depend on that. So again, you have to be aware of your limitations with the half squad. Don't send it in thinking it's going to be able to get a Panzerfaust when you only have a 1 or 2 chance out of 6 of getting one. Also be aware that your half squads, even your assault engineer half squads, they lose their smoke exponent capability. They lose assault fire, spray fire capability. They retain their underlying morale in this case, but their next step is going to be either disrupted or gone, broken. So you're going to be losing a lot of capability when you go to half squad status. Just bear that in mind. Again, the cost benefit ratio between whether or not you stay as a full squad or whether you deploy into a half squad. And lastly, a leader. In the rally phase, you have the option of deploying a squad. Say I want to give both of these weapons to this one guy here, assuming I make my normal task check. I can break into my 2 components. And then in my movement phase, I can transfer my weapons, and now this guy is free to carry on and do with what he wants. This, in this particular case, maybe that was in the best interest. However, if this unit had been broken instead, maybe instead of deploying the squad, I would probably want to bring this guy back. So leaders usually have better things to do than deploying squads. Again, situational dependent. If you've got the time and space and it fits your plan, by all means, deploy if you're allowed to. But typically your leaders got better fish to fry than trying to deploy your squads. Again, use your 10% at the beginning, and if you have the time and space, maybe do it in the middle of a game, but you don't have to necessarily convert your whole force into a bunch of half squads. Now, having said that, I'm aware that some guys have tried that, and to varying degrees of success. Again, situationally dependent. It's dependent on the force you're playing, your opponent, the conditions of the terrain, and the objectives of the mission determines all that. And a good general will use all the tools in the toolbox at your disposal. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, just to let you guys know. All right, so that was a quick look at Tactics 101 with the half squad. So again, versatility is the order of the day. They have their benefits. They also have their glaring weaknesses, and you have to weigh the pros and cons of using them. Know when to split them up, and know when you're allowed to split them up automatically. Even if you can't deploy, you may want to use the benefits of taking POWs just so that you can split up your squads into half squads to meet your goals. Again, as an attacker or even as a defender, if it's in your best interest to have half squads running around, and the only way you can do it is by capturing prisoners, that you may have to use that route. And there's other ways as well. Again, we discussed, amphibians and boats, as well as maybe gliders or paradrops. You might be able to break into half squad components that way and get around the nationality restrictions. Again, just introductory tactics on how to use half squads. So if you have the journal edition number 11, which came out, I believe, 2016, I'm hoping there's an electronic version so I can get my hands on it soon. I don't own it, but if you do, there's an article from Aaron Cleven in it called The Halfling. I highly recommend you give that a read. He's drawn on the experience of several players to come up with supposedly a fairly extensive article on how to use half squads. And hopefully this article and this tutorial has gone a long way to improve that. And hopefully you guys use them. Now, I'd like to hear how you guys use your half squads, and if you have any recommendations towards using them or warnings on when not to use them. I'd really appreciate it. Fill up the comments, and we'll talk to you guys next video. Bye-bye.